Today, we are going to start with an insight of the halachos ktanos. And we're talking about the Gemara that we studied regarding los silbash shatnes. And the Gemara had said, just to reiterate, that if the Torah would have said los silbash, we would have thought that the only isur would be levisha. When you wear it, the nafish hana'asa, and he gets a maximum amount of hana. He protects his body, from the shoulders down. Aval ha'lo, let's say in a case where he sort of drapes something over his body, and he's not interested in hana. Let's say, for example, the classic case would be a towel where he dries himself with a towel after he comes out of the shower, and the towel is shatnes, he would not violate the Isur shatnes. And the Gemara says, therefore, the Torah had to use the term lo yale olecha to prohibit even halah. And the Gemara works out, if you recall, kind of a middle of the road, a compromise, somewhere between the two extremes. It's not a full-fledged levisha, it's not a full-fledged halah, but somewhere in the middle, where he has a halah, but he benefits from it as a levisha. Oh. Right, we didn't get to that discussion yet. My assumption is at this point that sitting on something would neither be halah nor levisha. I don't know what the basis for that chumrah would be. So we're going to now quote an insight of the halachos ktanos. And if I remember correctly, his name was Chagiz. But in any event, he says the following: Hadas nota she'ein beged chayav b'tzitzis el kilov shenosa below ba'alah. When the Torah describes the mitzvah of tzitzis, it uses the following phrase: asher techaseh bo. And that implies that you are covering your entire body. You're not just using it as a kind of a towel that you drape over your body. And you'd only be chayav in tzitzis if you wear a beged derech levisha. But now we have a hekesh between tzitzis and kilayim. And we're saying that the Torah tells you that you do not violate kilayim at all. There's no violation if you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis. But it's interesting because on the one hand, you're going to be violating kilayim even in a quote-unquote halah scenario, but yet the mitzvah of tzitzis does not apply in that case. So there's no perfect equation here between the mitzvah of tzitzis and the isur of levishas kilayim, because in the case of kilayim, the prohibition expands, and the scope of kilayim includes even a case of halah. Whereas with regard to tzitzis and the mitzvah and the chiyuv of tzitzis, that has a limited scope, and it only applies to levisha. Now, if you would therefore summarize the halachos ktanos with the following question: which is more chamur, kilayim or tzitzis? Your answer would certainly be that kilayim is more chamur than tzitzis, insofar as its scope is that much wider, and it includes even halah, whereas tzitzis has a more limited scope. However, he points out that in the sugya of tzitzis, in Masechet Menachos, and this is on Daf Mem Aleph, in Masechet Menachos, Tosfos writes that tzitzis has a chumrah above and beyond kilayim. And why is that so? Because a person is only in violation of kilayim if he wears the beged. But with regard to tzitzis, if, let's say, for example, a person would be matzia beged shal arba kanfos tachtav, chayav b'tzitzis. Now, this touches on what Mitch was saying, but in the opposite direction. That whereas in Kilayim, the Isa Kilayim is limited to Levisha, in the case of a Beged for Tzitzis, if you have 4 knofos on a garment, it's a 4-cornered garment, and he places it down underneath him, Tosas says, you're chayav in tzitzis. So that would be one example. Again, we don't paskin like this, Tosas, but one example of a Rishon who goes on record as defining the scope of tzitzis way beyond that of Kilayim. Because in Kilayim, you're not chayav in Kilayim unless you wear the Kilayim, but you're allowed to put the Kilayim underneath your body. But in the case of tzitzis, if you have a beged of Dalet Kafas underneath your body, you're chayav in tzitzis. And now we go on to another example. Hagos Maimonides on the Rambam in Perek Gimel Milchat Tzitzis writes that if someone is chayav in tzitzis because he wears this beged during the day, he's chayav even if he wears it at night, so that's called a ksus yom balayla. He's going to have to put tzitzis on a sadin. Wow, this is amazing. But again, this is what Mitch was talking about, but not in terms of Kilayim, in terms of tzitzis. That goes, Maimonides thinks in the Rambam that if you are sleeping on a sheet, if this sheet is a beged yom, and in which case, if you would wear it during the day, so let's say you have, what's it called in, it's like a Mexican word, a poncho. Let's say you had a 4-cornered poncho, and you wear it during the day. Let's say on a cold day, you'd wear it as a way of warming up your body. It's got 4 corners. It's chayav in tzitzis. And now at night, you place it as a sadin, as a sheet, and you go to sleep on top of this poncho. So now Laila is potter from tzitzis, but he wakes up in the morning before Hanetz. No, he wakes up after Hanetz. So it's already daylight. He's chayav in tzitzis, and it's a beged yom, which he wore at night, but now it's daytime. So that goes, Maimonides writes that according to the Rambam, in such a case, you're chayav in tzitzis. As soon as the sun rises, with daybreak, he's chayav in tzitzis. So there are 2 scenarios in which you are chayav in tzitzis, although you're not included in the lav of Kilayim. You don't violate the lav of Kilayim. In both cases, there's no Kilayim because there's no levisha. On the other hand, tzitzis does not require levisha, and according to that goes Maimonides, and it's really based on the Tosaf Menachos, when you're laying on top of a beged, and that beged has 4 kadfos, then you're chayav in tzitzis. Now, normally, it's a sheet that you use for night sleeping. So it's a beged lila, and therefore you're not chayav in tzitzis even by yom. But in a reverse situation where you had a beged yom, and you used it as a sheet at night, and you're sleeping on it, you're going to be chayav in tzitzis. So says that goes Maimonides. The sheet is a Rambam. So we put together the Rambam and Tosfos. We have a chumrah in tzitzis that doesn't apply to Kilayim. And it's all the reverse of what we saw in halachas ketanos. Because in halachas ketanos we said that in Kilayim there's a chumrah because the Torah says lo yale olech, to prohibit even something that's not a levisha, but it's derech halah. In tzitzis, claims the Baal halachas ketanos, since it says asher techasava, it's only derech levisha. So we have 2 arrows going in opposite directions. In the context of the Baal halachas ketanos, we have a chumrah in a broader scope of the application of these Kilayim vis-a-vis tzitzis. In the context of Tosfos in Menachos, plus Agos Maimonides on the Rambam, we have an expanded scope in tzitzis and a chumrah that does not apply in the case of Kilayim. which means that if you slept on top of a sheet and the sheet was made of a shatnez of pishtan and semer, you would not violate Isur Kilayim. It's very possible you'd be chayiv in tzitzis. And the reason for being chayiv in tzitzis would be either because it's considered asher techaseba, or more likely because if it's a ksus yom and then you sleep on it at night and now with daybreak you're chayiv in tzitzis. Okay, Rabosai. Now we begin a fascinating sugya, not in the Gemara, it's in the Gemara that we did on Daf Daled, but in the conceptual world of what I call Sefer HaMitzvahs. Sefer HaMitzvahs opens up worlds in terms of what we call lumdus. And we're going to open up to the Rambam in the Lav of Shatnez. This is Lotasek Kuf Ayin Tes, if you want to make a note of it, 179. And the Rambam writes that even though the Torah repeats the Avera, the Lav of Kilayim twice, you only get one set of Malchus. And this is an application of the Rambam's theory, the Rambam's principle, that ein lokin shtei malchios al kol azhara shenichbala b'Torah. When the Torah repeats a lav, you only get one set of malchus. And we'll soon see that the Ramban has a different take on this. So, for example, the Torah says sheretz haaretz lo socha, or sheretz haaretz lo sochelu. You would only be chayav malchus once for eating a sheretz, according to the principle established by the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvahs. Because the Torah is just repeating the same lav, it's not adding a new chiyuv malchus. When the Torah gives what we call shnei shemos, the Torah has two different categories of an Isur. They may belong to a greater whole, but they are different one from the other, and each one sets itself up as a unique category. Then you get two Malchios in an overlap situation. But if the Torah is simply being machpil, just repeating the same Azhara, then you only get one set of Malchos. That's the Shita of the Ram. The ein lokin shtei malchios el al shnei shemos shel isurim. You have to have two categories of isurim in order to generate a double malchus. So if you violate, as I said, both these shemos with one action, you'll precipitate two sets of malchus. Adkan shitas haram. Now you know that the main critique of the Rambam is, of course, the Ramban. And the Ramban writes his critique primarily on what's called the shroshim of the Rambam. The Rambam has an extensive, it's almost a work unto itself, introduction to Sefer HaMitzvahs, which is called the shroshim. And the Ramban wrote a critique on Sefer HaMitzvahs, but most of what the Ramban critiques of the Rambam is in the shroshim. We're in the 9th shoresh, and the Ramban writes, Lavim shenichpalu yesh malchus keminyan alavim. If the Torah repeats the same lav, you get malchus for each time the Torah repeats that lav. And his proof is from our sugya of Kilayim. On the one hand, the Torah says lo silbash shatnez, and that's one lav. On the other hand, the Torah says regarding shatnez lo yale olecha, and that's another lav. And in such a case, the Ramban argues you get two sets of malchios. Now again, you may argue, well, the Torah only repeated the lav in order to clarify, right? As we saw in our sugya here on Daf Daled Beis, if we only had this lav, we would have limited it this way. We have the other lav. to expand it that way. And then the law of Halah also teaches Temru Pishtan, etc., etc. But it doesn't matter. According to the Ramban Shita, even if the Torah was, quote unquote, compelled to repeat the law in order to teach us something about the Avera and its scope, nevertheless, it incurs and generates a separate set of Malchus, a second set of Malchus. Okay, now we read a little piece from the Ramban. He writes, Al Tamo Shal Rambam Kosher Im Yesh Shnei Lavim B'Shatnis Vayitzorach Lios Shamalo Yilka Achas Valovesh Yilka Shtayim. He says the following. The Rambam gives you the impression, by counting the mitzvah of Shatnez, the Isur Shatnez only once, and applying his principle, as the Rambam formulated in the ninth Shoresh, in the Sefer Shroshim, the Shroshim of the Sefer Mitzvahs, then you get the impression from the Rambam that he's only going to max out at one set of Malchus for violating Shatnez. Says Ramban, that can't be true. Why? If he violates Halah and Ochinam, it's only one set of Malchus. But if he violates Levisha, then we should apply the principle, so to speak, of Yesh B'Chal Masayim Bana. Every Levisha is a violation of not only Lo Silbash, but also Lo Yale Alecha. It's a violation of Halah, because every Levisha includes Halah. And therefore, in a case of a person who violates Halah, he gets one set of Malchus, but he violates Levisha, he should be incurring two sets of Malchus, because he's first of all being Mala, he's certainly covering himself with the Shatnez, and at the same time he's doing a full-fledged Levisha. Every Levisha includes Halah within it. And in order to prove this point, that by doing a Levisha, he's doing an action that goes beyond Halah, but at the same time includes Halah, and therefore he should get two sets of Malchus. And why does the Rambam give us the impression that for the violation of Shatnez, you max out at one set of Malchus? He illustrates this, or should I say embellishes this, with an analogy. What happens to a Kohen who enters into an Oel Hames? The Torah says, Lo Yavo, you're not allowed to enter, addressing the Kohen. And at the same time, the Torah says, Lo Yitamen, that the Kohen is not allowed to contract Tumah. And in this case, you violate both Lavim and you get two sets of Malchus. He went into the Oel and he was Mitami himself. So again, the Torah has repeated this Lav twice because there are different dimensions of the Lav. One is the entry into this Makom, and the other is the contracting of the Tumah. And if he does both, he incurs a double violation with two sets of Malchus. The same thing should apply in the case of Halah in Levisha Shatnez. The Levisha should engender a Chi of Malchus for Halah because every Levisha includes Halah. And at the same time, he violates the Isur Lo Tilbash, and he gets a second set of Malchus for Levisha. Now, what we're about to embark upon is a very technical, mechanical answer to defend the Rambam. And even though you know my style, I'm not such a big fan of mechanics. I never even took a course in mechanics. But let's give it a shot. It's the Rosh Yeshiva Panovich, Rav Shach, in his magnum opus called the Aviyah Ezri. He wrote many different things, and he writes the following. And first, before he tries to explain the Rambam, he adds fuel to the flame, and he jacks up the kasha even further. which is interesting that sometimes the methodology is that if you have one kasha, ask another kasha, and then you can answer the two kashas with one bird, with one stone, I should say. The Kesef Mishnah proves from the Rambam that with regard to the Isser of Levisha, as opposed to Allah, there is no condition of Hana. Hana is not a relevant factor in Levisha. It's very relevant in Halah, and it could be that, for example, Mocher Iksus might be Halah. We weren't exactly sure, if you remember the other day, why Mocher Iksus is Halah, whereas Mavriche Meches is Levisha. But be that as it may, in the case, I'm just going to say Balabatish, don't take me literally, but in the case of Mocher Iksus, he's wearing many, many layers of garden, and therefore the outer layer, the mink coat that he's trying to sell in the market, is only a Halah. And that's why the Rambam says it depends on Hana, not Hana, and he's not getting any Hana if he doesn't have Kavanah for Hana. Therefore, the Rambam is Matir Mocher Iksus. But in the case of a full-fledged Levisha, like, for example, Mavriche Meches, where he has to actually wear the garment without any layers in order to convince the tax collector that this is the garment that covers his body, but he is involved in a Levisha, and the Rambam prohibits it. Bottom line is, according to Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam, there's a fundamental difference between Levisha and Hana, and Halah. In the case of Halah, the precondition for the violation of Halah is Hana. In the case of Levisha, there's something called a Maisa Levisha, even in the absence of Hana, and that's a violation. Says the Avi Ezri, according to this interpretation of the Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam, for sure, we have two different actions here, two different Maisa Avera that are independent one of the other. One is based on the Hana, and that's the case of Halah, and the other is the Maisa Levisha per se, even in the absence of Hana. And if that be the case, then if a person is Lovesh Beged and he has Hana, then the Hana element will precipitate the violation of Halah, whereas Levisha, the Maisa Levisha, precipitates the violation of Lo Silvash of Levisha. So clearly, we have two different Maisei Avera, one called Halah, where the Isser is generated by the Hana and his intent for the Hana, which he doesn't have in the case of Mocher Iksus, and another Maisa, which is called a full-fledged Maisa Levisha, where he wears something that covers his whole body in a normal Levisha, normal way, and therefore Halah and Levisha are essentially two different Maisa. And that really further illustrates the Ramban's objection against the Rambam that in the case of a full-fledged Levisha, if he has intention to be Nene from Levisha, and a classic Levisha, he should be chayav two sets of Malkus. Because in effect, he's doing two different Isurim. One is the Isur of Hana, which is classified under Halah, and then the Isur Levisha as a separate independent Maisa Levisha. And he is implementing both in a case where he was Lovesh Kalayim and he had intention for Hana to benefit from. So the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvahs counts the Isa Levisha as one Isa. And according to the Kesef Mishnah, so asks Rav Shah, the Rambam should have counted a separate lav, a separate lotus under Halah. Because Halah, according to the Kesef Mishnah's understanding of the Rambam, is essentially an Isur Hana, whereas Levisha is an Isur in the Maisa Levisha. These two Pu'ulos are so separate from each other, and each derived from a different pasuk, by the way, that the Rambam should have certainly counted them as two separate lav. So we have now basically two objections against the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvahs. Number one, the first objection is that of the Ramban. How could the Rambam generate one set of Malkus and claim, well, the Torah repeated the law It's not just a repetition of the lav. These two lavim may or may not overlap. And if they do overlap, then there should be a double set of malchus. Why does Rambam seem to limit it to one set of malchus? And furthermore, the second kasha, based on the Kesef Mishnah, this is already the kasha of the Avi Ezri, is why does the Rambam count Shatnez as one lav in Taryag, when in fact there are two different lavim? Because according to Kesef Mishnah, one is the Maisa Avera of Allah with Allah, and the other is the Maisa Levisha as a separate independent Maisa Avera. And these two Pa'ulos are derived from two different psukim. We have all the trimmings of two different lavim in Taryag. Okay, now we get to the answer of Rav Shach. Again, put on your technical, mechanical thinking cap. He says that we have to quote another Rambam here. We have to bring in the cavalry. It's the Rambam in the 8th parak of Macholos Asuros. There's a lot of Torah on that Rambam. And the Rambam in Parak Ches Macholos Asuros Halacha Tezayin writes that if you violate an Isur Hana, you don't get malchus. I think my Rebbe used to call it a lav tofen. No, it's the real lav is, let's say, achila, lama zogin arla, klaya kerem, or any of the other Isuri Hana. The real lav is, the Torah says, don't eat it. But we derive an additional avera of hana. But that's not the real bakoy avera. That's not the ikar lav. It's only tofen. It's a secondary kind of lav. But be that as it may, there could be many different explanations of the sheet. The Rambam holds there's no malchus on Isuri Hana. Now, what about the case of Basa B'chol? We all know that the Torah repeats Basa B'chol 3 times, also Vasha. And one of those repetitions is to establish the Isur Hana. So now we have a very interesting case. It's not an Isur Hana that's derived from the Isur Achila in the same lab, in the same pasuk, that one verse in the Torah implies an additional Isur Hana on top of the explicit verse that prohibits Achila, but rather we have a separate verse in the Torah, Lo Savashel Gedi B'Chalev Imo, referring to the Isur Hana. And here, Rav Shach invokes the Mishnah Lamelech, one of the greatest commentaries on the Rambam. And he writes that in Basa B'Cholav, even though we have a separate pasuk for the Isur Hana, nevertheless, you don't get malchus for an Isur Hana. Meaning that an Isur Hana and the violation thereof is qualitatively different than an Isur Achila. And because of the so-called inferior, lower level of quality of Hana vis-a-vis Achila, you don't get malchus. It's irrelevant as to whether or not the Torah prohibits Hana with a separate verse. So even if the Torah would say, quote, Lo tehenu mi arla, or Lo tehenu mi kalayim, Lo tehenu mi basa v'chalav, and the Torah explicitly would prohibit Hana, you still would not get malchus. The Rambam excludes malchus for Yisuri Hana without any exception, without any qualification, straight across the board. Even in the case of Basa B'Cholav, where there's a separate lav in the Torah to prohibit Hana. So in other words, we have a separate lav ha'hana in the case of Basa B'Cholav, and yet it does not incur malchus, even though it's a lav b'fnei atzmo to prohibit Hana. Says Rav Shach, and I quote, "Vi adrava min adin sheba achila yilke shtayim, achas mishum achila, vi achas mishum hanoas achila." In other words, the Rambam is very paradoxical. We have a double violation. The Torah says, "Don't eat basa b'cholav," and then the Torah prohibits having hana from basa b'cholav. Now, in the case of Achila, he violates both Achila with the Maisa Achila and Hana because he benefits from the Achila. He should therefore be Chayev Shtayim. There must be, says Rav Shach, some technical rule here that even if you have two different actions, and even if you find two different psukim in the Torah prohibiting each one of those actions respectively, in an overlap of those two actions, the Rambam Shita is, as paradoxical as it seems, that you only get one set of malchus, even though all the conditions are extant for two sets of malchus. Number one, he has two different psukim. Number two, he has two different maisa avera. And number three, he has now a maisa, which is an overlap of both of these two maisa. What's lacking over here? Why should he not get malchus twice? And hopefully, the answer to that question will shed a light on Shatnez, because we have the Isur Levisha, which is a Maisa Levisha. We have the Isur Halah, derived from a different puzzle, which is Hana, even without Levisha. And in a case of Levisha, he has both Levisha and Halah. Why doesn't he get two sets of law? What's the kasha the Rambam? Says the Avi Ezri, me'achar shekibul chazal shelo tavashel hainu achila. That even though it says lo tavashel, don't cook basar b'chol. It doesn't say anywhere don't eat basar b'chol. Chazal had a Kabbalah that when it says lo tavashel, it means lo socha. V'areza kilu nichtav b'Torah b'ferish lo socha. Now, again, we're going to skip an entire discussion here about a sugya psachim, and we're going to just take the bottom line. And the bottom line is that when the Torah says lo sochal, or any other language prohibiting achila, it includes hana as well. That's also prohibited, unless the Torah was matir, like in the case of nevela. The Torah says lo sochal called nevela, and then it says lager, etc. V'lakel tashlichut os, allowing hana. So now, in the case of basar b'cholav, based on the Kabbalah of Chazal, lo savashel means lo sochal. Then we apply the principle that whenever the Torah says lo sochal, it includes even an isur hana. Now, generally speaking, if a person eats something, he gets hana from it. Is therefore stam achila yesh bo hana. Case, we should say yesh lomar shekol isur achila hu machmas hana shebo. In other words, you're going to ask me, why did the Torah have to say lo savashel a second time if we have a Kabbalah, an oral tradition that lo savashel means lo socha? And then we apply the principle that whenever the Torah prohibits achila, it prohibits hana as well. Why was there a compelling need to have an extra lo savashel gediba chalev imo in order to derive the isur hana? Why isn't it enough that lo savashel means lo sochal, and hence echad isur achila, echad isur hana? Torah shuv, nevertheless, the Torah repeats lo savashel lesar behana. Now, what do we derive from the fact that the Torah felt compelled to add an extra lo savashel to prohibit hana when we could have derived hana from lo sochal? Because every achila implies hana. And the answer is the Torah is setting up two different isurim. The Torah is taking hana out of the original lo sochal, which is lo savashel, right? And setting up its own isur hana with a separate law. And that is a Gili Milsa that reveals to us that Hana and Achila are two separate Isurim. Now, again, if I'd stop here at this point in the Shach, he doubles up the problem, because the more you tell me that we separate Achila and Hana has a separate lav, the more I would think that he should get two sets of mouths. Oh. He says the following: Lefi said, "Eitan shnei ksurim echad lachilu v'echad lana, ela b'kosav hasheni malamed al geder ha'isurim amurim b'kosav harishon." This is very technical. Again, we're going to give it a shot. If we don't like it, then we'll blame ourselves that we weren't, we didn't learn in Panovich when the Rosh Yeshiva gave the shir, the public shir. He says the following: that if the second pasuk is coming to reveal or shed a light on the definition of the first pasuk, meaning the second Lo Savasha that teaches me in Isra Hana, is revealing that the first pasuk of Lo Sochal is Achila without Hana, and we're redefining the first Isra as an Isra Achila, then may Achar Shegam Isra Hana Nichal b'Pasuk Harishon Shel Achila. In other words, what's going on here is that the Torah, through the extra Lotzavashel for Hana, is revealing that the Hana is included in Achila. It's a Gili Milsa on the first verse. That's the main point of this Rav Shach. Umishum kach ein lokin olav shekain ein mefurish bo lehedger. So let's just understand the structure of the mechanics of Rav Shach. Rav Shach is offering the following methodology, or if we outline the framework of his methodology, it works like this: that if a second pasuk is revealing the nature and the scope of the Isur formulated in the first pasuk, then there's no second set of malchus, because it really is not a separate Isur that the Torah is formulating in the second pasuk, but rather it's a Gili Milsa to reveal the application of the first law, of the first pasuk. And it's telling me in the case of Bas B'Chalav that Hana is also included in the Isur Achila. He says, Mishum kach ein lokin. It means that the Torah, by using the Lo Savashel a second time to indicate that Achila includes Hana, it never went ahead and set up the Isur Hana as a separate law. Because if you ask me where in the Torah does it say, thou shalt not benefit and feed your dog basar v'chalav, the answer is I don't find it in the Torah. All I find it is in Torah Shebal Peh, the Chazal understood that the extra Lo Savashel is coming to interpret the original primary Isur of Achila and expand its scope to include Hana. You can only get one set of malchus in that case. And now we swing back to first base or home plate, and we talk about the Isur Halah and the Isur Lo Silbash. Liolam ein kamel alav shelo silbash. There's only one Isur, Lo Silbash. It says Lo Yale Olecha. Ze Gilui al halav shelo silbash. She'eno Isur machmas hana shebel levisha. Ela levisha hi Isur b'fnei atzmo af below hana. V'anos halah below levisha Isur b'fnei atzmo. Ach mikom ein kan shnei lavim ela Isur halah kolu Bilav shelo silbash. And therefore, ein lokino. So it means the following: when the Torah is defining a new Isur, but it doesn't do it explicitly as a lav that mentions that Isur, then what the Torah is telling me is a Gili Milsa, I'm just revealing and shedding a light on the original Isur. So the Torah never prohibits Hana in the case of Shatnes per se, meaning Neto, the Torah never says thou shalt not benefit from Shatnes. The Torah is only telling me in Lo Yala Alecha that you can have a violation of Lo Silbash even in the absence of a Maisa Levisha with Hanas Halah. But it's all one Isur because we never found an explicit Isur in the context of Shatnis of Hana. It must be that the Torah is now revealing something about the nature of Lo Silbash. And you can violate Lo Silbash in two different ways. Through a Maisa Levisha, or through a Maisa Halah sheyesh bo Hana. So again, what are the ground rules here according to Rav Shach? He sets up a whole structure of rules, of mechanical rules. If the Torah sets up an explicit law, like if the Torah had written Lo tehenu mi basa b'cholom, that would certainly engender a separate, independent chiyuv malchus, and it would be counted in Taryag as a separate law. But now let's go to rule number 2. What if the Torah doesn't say explicitly, thou shalt not benefit, lo tehena, but rather we derive it as a drasha, we'll call it Torah Sheba'al Peh. Then the rule is that drasha is coming to reveal the definition of the original Isur. That basa b'cholim is not just an Isur achila, but it's also an Isur hana. But if we're coming to expand and interpret and define the original Isur, then we only have one line. And this last rule will play the role in the case of Halah and Levisha. We had 2 kashas on the Rambam. Number 1, why doesn't the Rambam in the case of Levisha sheyesh bo Halah incur 2 sets of malchus? And number 2, why doesn't the Rambam count Halah as a separate lav in the minion of Taryag? Both questions are answered. Because since the Torah never says explicitly, do not benefit, do not enjoy a hana from shatnes, the Isur hana is not explicit in the pasuk, then the mechanism tells me that the Lo Yala Alecha is a revelation that sheds light on the original lav of Lo Silbash shatnes, to teach me that Lo Silbash has, it's like an umbrella lav that includes both the Maisa Levisha without Hana and the Halah and the Hana and the Halah without the Levisha when there's Hana. And so too in the case of Basa B'cholah, the repetition of Lo Savashil is not an explicit mention of Hana, it just says don't cook. But based on Torah Sheba'al Peh, we're going to interpret it as thou shalt not have Hana, says Rav Shach in such a case. That's going to shed a light on the original lav of Achila. That the original lav of Achila engenders also an Isur Hana. And if through Achila I violate both the Isur Achila and Hana, I only have one lav. And therefore, I only get one set of them.
That means you get the person like IV injection.
So then, but leaving out the other issue of Hana Shelo Kedarka, because we need Kederach Hana, but leaving that out for a moment, then you'd get Malchus for Hana. Why? Because the Lo Savashel is now revealing that the original Isur Achila splits into 2. It generates an Isur Achila and it generates an Isur Hana. If I get benefit from Basa B'cholah without Achila, then I get Malchus for the original Isur Achila, because the original Isur Achila includes an Isur Hana even without Achila. But I would never have a situation in which I incur two sets of malchus, even though in the case of achila, I also violate the Isra Hanoah. But it doesn't matter. The Isra Hanoah is only an expansion of the original Isra Achila. And so too, the Loyala Lecha and Shatnez is only an expansion of the Isra Levisha, and explains it towards the Isra Hanoah, telling me that even in the absence of Levisha, you'll get Malchus for the Isra Hanoah of Allah. But you won't get two sets of Malchus in a case where there's an overlap of Levisha plus Allah, because the pasuk of Allah is not explicit, meaning the Isra Hanoah is not explicit. And if the Isra Hanoah is not explicit, then the Isra Hanoah that is implied in Lo Yala Alecha is a revelation on the Isra Levisha and sets up a new category of Hanoah. It's very, very mechanical. I mean, honestly, my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik would never have said such a thing, not in a million years. It's not his style. Everything has to be glatt, got categories, Seidinim, 2 dimensions. Here it's, but the truth is, I have to tell you that from the little I know about Sefer HaMitzvahs, and when I say a little, I mean really a little. I mean, my friend Rabbi Ilson is spending years of his life trying to go through the Shroshim and the Sefer HaMitzvahs. I mean, it's a world, literally a world, very profound, he told me, very profound. From time to time, through my Chaver Alan Dubin, who learns with Rabbi Ilson, I get a little bit of a taste of what they're doing in the Sefer HaMitzvahs. I mean, if he ever publishes, I don't know if you know Rabbi Ilson, he's an outstanding Talmud Chacham with a tremendous koach of logic, and his logic is just compelling. Everything. I learned Masechet Peah with Rabbi Ilson for about a year. We went through Yerushalmi Peah. We never finished it. And I remember every time I said something, he would slug me up because it wasn't logically 100%. On one occasion, he said to me, Ken Zion could be. Because of that Ken Zion of Rabbi Ilson, I wrote a 40-page article in the Ora Mizra on what's called Mafsikin Lepeah. If it got by Rabbi Ilson, then it was worth something. No, Sefer HaMitzvahs is very profound. It's a whole world. But what I do, my impression from, as I say, the little I know in Sefer HaMitzvahs, is that it's very technical. It's not just, the classic Lumdisha conceptual categorization. It's very, very mechanical. You have to know the rules and the regulations, when you count it, when you don't count it, when you do get a separate set of malchus, when you don't. And Rav Shach is jumping into the fire over here, and he says that if you want to set up two separate lavim with two separate malchus, then it's got to be that the second lav not only engenders a new Maisa Vera independent of the first, but it's got to be written explicitly in the Torah Lahedra. If it's only al pi derech Torah Sheba'al Peh, then the second lav is nothing more than a gilui milsa to reveal the nature and the scope of the first lav. So you're left with only one lav, which will count it in mitzvahs as one and will only engender one set of malchus. And that's the case of Hanoah and Basar B'cholav. And Rav Shach is applying that to the case of Halah in Shat, which is also, as we saw in the case of Mishnah, an Iser Hanoah. Okay, let's make a note of where we got to here, and now we go back to the Gemara itself. So we're up to Daf Hey Amud Beis. And if you recall, the last thing that we were learning on the top of Hey Amud Beis was from whence do we derive the principle of Esei Dochel Losase, and we need something called Mufne in order to accept what we call a drush of Smuchim. And the Gemara wants to know whether or not there's something Mufne in the parsha of Shatnez. And the Gemara builds its case on the extra word yachto, which you'll see here on the fifth line. Let's count it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 line down from the top. Yachtov lamali. In other words, the Torah could have left out the word yachtov, and we would have derived from that the conclusion that this parsha has what's called mufne, an element of redundancy, which will allow me to apply the principle of yesh lidrosh smuchin, certainly according to the Chachamim, and even according to Rabbi Yehuda, insofar as we're in Mishnah Torah. So if it's Mishnah Torah, Rabbi Yehuda accepts smuchin, but only on the condition that it's mufne. And here we have the word yachtov that sets up mufne. Then we had yesterday a rejection of yachtov because we need yachtov for the principle called tokef shtei tchifos, which means that he has to do a double tefira of the minimum of 2 tefiros of tzemer and pishtin yachtov in order to violate and create a beged of shatnez. So we're up to imkan, which you'll see approximately, was it 7 lines down from the top? I didn't count it, but imkan, and the Gemara is saying that if these parshios are necessary and every single word teaches me something, reveals a new din, and therefore we cannot derive smuchin, it's lichtov rachmana, lo silbash semer ufishtin yachto shatnez lo. The word shatnez is just a description of what we had in the pasuk. The pasuk is talking about semer ufishtin yachto, which means that with 2 tefiros he connected and sewed together or wove together both linen and wool. Why do you have to add the word shatnez to describe something that is self-explanatory? So the Gemara answers, wait a minute, we have a very fundamental halacha and a precondition in this violation of Allah that we derive from the word shatnez. Mi boile ad sheyehei shua tavi v'nuz. It's enough that you sew together 2 chutim of tzemer upishtan, but you need shua. Shua means srukin umuchlakim. They are well combed and softened out. Number 2, you need tavu. Tavu means that you have to wrap them around the linen and the the linen thread with the garment thread, wrap it around as if it was tavli, as if it was woven together. And finally, you need nuz. Nuz is called arugim ke'echad. So basically what we're involved in here is 3 halachas derived from notrika. Notrika means when we take letters of a word as beginnings of a word, and we have shua, tavu, and nuz. All 3 halachas derived from the word shatnez. Now, what is arugim ke'echad? This last condition of nuz. So Rashi doesn't give us much. He just gives us the arugim ke'echad. But in the footnote here, he says, and he quotes here a Rashba here and a Ritva there and a Ramban in Nida. I mean, it's a lot of different sources that all these 3 requirements of Shua, Tavi, and Nuz, mityachasim l'taroves hatzemer im hapishton. To what extent is there a mixture of the linen with the wool? And ain't Shuva, Tavi, and Nuz. Now, this is really complicated because there's one sheet in Rishonim that Shua Tavi B'nuz is a description not of the mixture of linen and wool, but of each string in and of itself, of the wool string and of the linen strip. And then he just simply sews the two together. But each one independently has to be true tavui v'nus. So now we're really stuck. We thought that Tzemru Pishtan was Mufna. We said that no, Tzemru Pishtan is not Mufna. We thought that Yachta was Mufna. That's not Mufna. We thought that Shatnez is Mufna. That's not Mufna. Hello. So Gemara answers, Kula Shatnez Nafka. Vishatnez Nafka. All these dinim could be derived from the word shatnez. And shatnez indicates no trikun shua tavi v'nus. Once the Torah gave me shatnez, that one word would have indicated yachtav. We don't need yachtav if it's shatnez, because shatnez requires shua tavi v'nus. And the Torah just wants to set up this pasuk as mufne. And it does so and accomplishes that task by adding the word shatnez. And he adds the following. I'm just going to read to you in the Hebrew translation. He writes, Ilu hoisa kavanas hatoveh lasosa mufne, hoisa Torah koseves lo silbach klayim semeru pishtin yachtim. The Torah could have left out the word shatnez. Me'achar shekosva Torah loshen shatnez. Lo manu gam she'ehei shua tovi v'nus yachtim. I'm not sure what he means here, so we're going to have to come back to this on another occasion. But let's just see the next Gemara, because that's the main Gemara that we want to see. Ashkechan di osi esei v'dochi losa grei v'losa sheish bo kari seicha ashkechan v'dochi. What's the havamina in the case of achos isha that there would be a mitzvah of yibum to override the lav sheish bo kares of achos isha? And therefore, the itzrich le'aleha le'meisra. Therefore, we need the extra pasuk le'aleha to teach me that in the case of achos isha there is no yibum. Why would they have havamina without aleha that there would be yibum? You've only derived that the essay of tzitzis can override the regular classic law of kilayim, but you don't have any source that an essay has the power to override and trump a lav sheyesh bo kares, the likes of achos isha. And therefore, the Gemara now is looking for a source for essay docha lotzas sheyesh bo kares. We worked so hard to come up with a source for essay docha lotzas, but at the end of the day, we only got to one point, and not as far as we didn't go as far as we need to go. We only know that an essay is docha a lav, classic lav sheish bo malchus, but how do we know that an essay would override the lav sheish bo kares, and that would justify why we need the word aleh in the case of achos ishta? B'chi tema neilith mi mila. Mila on the 8th day overrides the Shabbos. Let's say there's a malach of netilas neshama when he takes out the dam mila, and Shabbos is an Isur skila. How much more so a lower Isur, which is only an Isur karetz? So in the case of Mila b'Shabbos, where the Torah says B'yom Hashmini Yimol B'Sar or Losa Afilu b'Shabbos, we have a source for Esei Docha Losa Sheyesh Bo Karetz, or Yesh Bo Misa, and certainly Karetz. So the Gemara says no. To the you have on one side of the scale the lav of Misa in Malacha Shabbos, But on the other side of the scale, you have a very heavy hitter essay, and that's Mila. Maybe the reason why Mila is up there so high in the echelon that it could override a Lav Sheish Bo Misa is because of the very heavy nature of the obligation of Mila, which we don't have in the case of Yibum. The Torah repeats the mitzvah of Mila. The Torah repeats the word bris in the parsha of Mila 13 times. In the footnote, he says, gracious Perik Yud Zayin. So I don't know if I'm going to have the call to read the 13 times. I'll just read a few of them. The etno brisi beini vanecha, ani hine brisi itoch, vakimosi, esbrisi, beinoch, beini ubeinoch, ubein zaracha, ve'ata esbrisi tishmor, etc., etc. It's 13 times. The word bris appears in the parsha of Mila. So Mila engenders no less than 13 brisos. And that puts Mila on such a high level, it's such a high-powered mitzvah that it could override even a Lav Sheish Bo Misa. That's the Chumras HaEsei of Mila. And the fact that Mila could override the Shabbos doesn't prove that the lav of the mitzvah of Yibum would override the lav of Achos Isha, which is a lav Sheish Bo Kares. So we can't derive any conclusions from Mila because Nichrasu Aleh Shlosh Tzvei. So the Gemara now offers another opportunity, the Pesach. The mitzvah of Korban Pesach overrides the Shabbos. Although, if I remember correctly, the Bnei B'Seira were a little bit unsure about that, but we paskin, based on the Gemara Pesachim Daf Ayin Zayin, it says in the parsha of Pesach Sheni in Bamidbar Perek Tes, V'yasu Bnei Yisrael es haPasach b'moado. And the Gemara says b'moado means if the 14th of Nisan coincides with Shabbos, we will bring the Korban Pesach. No, Pesach is also a high-powered mitzvah saseh, very unique. It's up there with Mila. Again, there's no 13 britzos, but Mala Pesach shekain kares. If a person fails to bring the Korban Pesach, then he's chayav kares. And in such a case, that high-powered essay will override even a lotas sheyesh ba kares. So it means that Pesach overrides the Shabbos because non-fulfillment of the mitzvah's essay of Pesach incurs a chiyuv kares. And that puts Pesach on a unique level. There are only two mitzvahs say in the Torah that generate kares. Non-fulfillment generates kares, and that's Mila and Pesach. So Pesach is really up there with Mila. Gemara attempts a third attempt to derive the conclusion that essay dochalosa seshesh bo kares, and that's from the Korban Tamid, because the shechita of Korban Tamid, based on the pasuk Ol Shabbos b'Shabbat, overrides the Shabbos. And here we have a case of a mitzvah say that overrides a chiyuv misa. Now, what strength or power can you give to upgrade? I'm sorry, getting ready the answer. Tamid, I meant to say, right? That Korban Tamid is so great that's why it overrides Shabbos. Again, Tamid doesn't have neither those 13 brisos of bris. It doesn't have a chiyuv kares. No one's chiyuv kares in an event that they absent the Tamid. And here's where the Gemara is going to introduce the concept of tadir and why a mitzvah tadira is on a special level that could override even the Shabbos. That's where we're going to stop for today. Make a note of it.
everything in it. Often,
Well, Pesach, we said it's not going to do it for us because
I'm saying,
it's a chiyuv korban.
instead of with korban or avos and mikdash, with everything in it, specifically focusing on something which is every day. Musaf is done on Shabbat.